Chapter 15. Ransom's Boys. It's my contention that the CIA not only engaged in a cultural Cold War in the abstract and purely pragmatic way, but that they had very definite aims in view, and they had a very definite aesthetic. They stood for high culture. Richard Ellman. In September 1954, Cord Meyer took over the International Organizations Division from Tom Braden, who retired one from the CIA and moved to California to edit a newspaper purchased for him by Nelson Rockefeller. Meyer inherited a division which constituted the greatest single concentration of covert political and propaganda activities of the by now octopus-like CIA. Furthermore, he did so in an atmosphere increasingly favorable to covert activity, as a top-secret report submitted to President Eisenhower in the same month shows. As long as it remains national policy, another important requirement is an aggressive covert psychological, political, and paramilitary organization more effective, more unique, and if necessary, more ruthless than that employed by the enemy. No one should be permitted to stand in the way of the prompt, efficient, and secure accomplishment of this mission. It is now clear that we are facing an implacable enemy whose avowed objective is world domination by whatever means and at whatever cost. There are no rules in such a game. Hitherto acceptable norms of human conduct do not apply. If the U.S. is to survive, long-standing American concepts of fair play must be reconsidered. It may become necessary that the American people be made acquainted with, understand, and support this fundamentally repugnant philosophy. Yet the importance of the International Organizations Division was not always reflected in the caliber of the staffers assigned to it. Tom Braden had struggled to inspire his own assistant, only to be met with total indifference. His name was Lieutenant Colonel Buffington. He left memos everywhere, but he didn't do jack shit, said Braden. He was a total waste of time. He did nothing all day. He would come in at 9, hang up his hat, read the New York Times, then go home again. 4. In a jokey attempt to trace the genealogy of case officers arriving in Paris, Josselson and his intimates referred to them as George I, George II, George III, and so on. George IV was Lee Williams, also jokingly known as Nickel and Dime, a play on his code name, and fleetingly as Mr. Rochester. Williams made a better impression than most of his predecessors, valiantly straddling the two cultures of an increasingly bureaucratized CIA and the Congress, which was almost bohemian in contrast. I remember driving along in Paris with Cord Meyer once after a meeting with Mike, and Cord turned to me and said, "You know, Lee, Mike really likes you." Williams remembered. "Son of a bitch. It's like he was surprised. But Mike liked me because I never tried to teach him his job. I sat at his feet. I was deferential to him." 5. But Josselson's real ally was Lawrence de Neufville, and he, after 10 years in Europe, wanted to go home. Assigned new cover in the New York office of Radio Free Europe, he left Paris in late 1953. De Neufville was never going to be an easy act to follow, and after him, Josselson came increasingly to think of the Congress case officers as messenger boys. At the beginning, the CIA were good, interesting people like Lawrence de Neufville, whose hearts were in the right places, said Diana Josselson. But then they became less and less impressive, and Michael came to like them less. Every now and then, a case officer would appear, and I could see Michael trying to disengage, but they would cling on. Michael would never have asked anything substantive of them. He was friends with them, talked about their families and careers, and I had the idea that they admired him. But Michael was determined to protect the Congress from the agency and from the possibility the relationship might be revealed. 6. According to Diana, the relationship between Michael and his agency colleagues became increasingly a charade. Since they wanted to pretend they were in control, Michael probably welcomed the opportunity to inform them of developments, to help the illusion along. Diana, who dutifully served case officers with the obligatory martini cocktails when they came to the Josselsons' apartment, later dismissed them as a necessary evil. They weren't half as important to me as my maid. One of the problems for Cord Meyer was that it was difficult to attract agency staffers to his division. Not that there was any shortage of suitable candidates. By the mid-1960s, it was the agency's boast that it could staff any college from its analysts, 50% of whom held advanced degrees, 30% doctorates, prompting one State Department official to say, "There are more liberal intellectuals per square inch at CIA than anywhere else in government." But these collegiate types had not joined the agency to do what they could do on campus. They were seeking adventure, not a job looking after the kind of people they could meet at high table. The people in the International Organizations Division were looked upon by a great many agency people as some kind of fluff on the side, particularly by those who felt what we ought to be doing is hard intelligence, and let's recruit the spies and get the documents, and the rest of this is just a bunch of nonsense, 8 said CIA officer Donald Jameson. Some people in CIA didn't think it was proper to be spending all this money on all these leftists. 9, Lawrence de Neuville confirmed. So Cord Meyer began to look elsewhere. Cord brought unique intellectual cachet, said Lee Williams. He had unique access to the intellectual community in America, and he had huge respect for literary men. 10. Entering Yale in 1939, Meyer had studied English verse from the metaphysical poets of the 17th century to the modern poetry of Yeats and T.S. Eliot under Professor Maynard Mack, who left us a permanent respect for the graceful majesty of that achievement and an ambition in some of us to try to write as well. 11. Meyer tried his hand at poetry, publishing some passable verses in the Yale Lit, of which he subsequently became editor. In 1942, Meyer graduated in English literature with a brilliant summa cum laude. His literary ambitions were thwarted by the war, in which his twin brother was killed, and Meyer himself lost an eye in Guam when a Japanese grenade exploded at his feet, subsequently earning him the CIA nickname Cyclops. Thereafter, he penned a few articles and, in 1980, his memoirs, Facing Reality. As editor of the Yale Lit, Meyer was following in the footsteps of James Jesus Angletori, who became the CIA's legendary chief of counterintelligence. A literary radical, Angleton had introduced Ezra Pound to Yale and founded the magazine of verse, Furioso, in 1939. His name as editor appeared on the masthead even when he was chief of counter-espionage in Rome. Angleton was the vital link in what became known as the P source, P standing for professor, which described the agency's connection with the Ivy League. Prominent members of the P source included William Sloane Coffin, a graduate of Yale who was recruited by Allen Dulles. Recalling his decision to join the agency, Coffin later said, "Stalin made Hitler look like a Boy Scout. I was very strongly anti-Soviet. In that frame of mind, I watched the Korean War shape up, but I didn't follow it too closely or question the causes. When I graduated from Yale in 1949, I was thinking of going into the CIA, but I went into the seminary instead. After a year at the Union Theological Seminary, when war with the Soviet Union seemed to be threatening, I quit to go into the CIA, hoping to be useful in the war effort. The CIA financed the non-communist left. They gave with minimal strings attached. In those days, I had no quarrel with American policy, but in retrospect, I wouldn't be so innocent and smirchless." 12 Coffin's Ivy League recruits included Archie Roosevelt, who had read English at Harvard under the famous head of Wadham College, Maurice Bowra, who was on exchange from Oxford for a year, and Archie's cousin, Kermit Kim Roosevelt, who was a few years ahead of him at Groton School and Harvard. Another major Ivy League connection, and the epitome of the P source, was Professor Norman Holmes Pearson, a revered humanist famous for editing the Viking 5-volume Poets of the English Language with W.H. Auden, and an officer of both the American Studies Association and the Modern Language Association, a trustee of the Breyer Foundation, and an executor of the poet H.D.'s estate. Pearson was also an OSS CIA incunabula. He trained many of the most promising minds at Yale, including Angleton and Richard Ellman, whom he recruited to OSS 13. He himself worked with X2, the counterintelligence branch of OSS, working in London during the war under Kim Philby, who later described him as naive. Pearson supervised the wartime accumulation of files on 1 million enemy agents and organizations, a practice he strongly felt should be continued after the war, despite its offensiveness to traditional Jeffersonian notions of government. Such quaint objections were quickly overcome as the term enemy acquired a very liberal definition. For turning to Yale, he presided over the promotion of American studies at home and abroad. Like foreign area studies, This new discipline was of clear imperial import in that it allowed us to understand our unique fitness for our post-war role as the world's governor, and encouraged a finer appreciation of our cultural sophistication among the ruled. 15, consistent with this view, was Pearson's preface to the Reinhardt edition of Thoreau's Walden, where he minimized the radicalism of the great American individualist and sought to release him from any association with anarchy, stressing that his writings were in support of better government, a symbol of the individual freedom on which we like to think the American way of life is based. Pearson's most famous protege was James Jesus Angleton. Born in Idaho in 1917, as a teenager, Angleton was sent to Malvern College in Worcestershire, where he worked at becoming more English than the English. He absorbed old-world courtesy and the quiet good manners that never deserted him. Indeed, the years gave him a European persona. He also spent long holidays in Italy that obscured his Yank background and gave him a slight English accent. 16, he was at Yale from 1937 to 1941, where he worked on the Yale Lit alongside McGeorge Bundy, the future National Security Advisor, Walter Sullivan, who later became science editor of the New York Times, and the poet E. Reed Whitmore, Jr. In 1938, Angleton met Ezra Pound in Rapallo, and they became firm friends, Pound later describing him as one of the most important hopes of literary magazines in the U.S. When Angleton wrote his will in 1949, he left a bottle of good spirits to Ezra Pound, E. Cummings, and other poet friends from Furioso, and concluded with the following credo: I can say this now, that I do believe in the Spirit of Christ and the life everlasting, and in this turbulent social system which struggles sometimes blindly to preserve the right to freedom and expression of the Spirit. In the name of Jesus Christ, I leave you. Despite these sentiments, Reed Whitmore remembered that Angleton, whose mother was Mexican, was embarrassed by his middle name because it suggested he was not an upper-class Englishman, which was then the image he was trying to project. 17, an old hand at conspiracy from OSS, Angleton carried his talents to the CIA, where he developed a seemingly limitless capacity for Byzantine intrigue. His first major success was the orchestration of America's covert campaign to secure victory for the Christian Democrats in the 1948 Italian elections. This campaign, closely watched and supported by George Kennan and Allen Dulles, was America's first successful act of political Cold Warfare. According to Kim Philby, Angleton was promoted to chief of the CIA's Office of Special Operations in 1949. For 20 years, he was in charge of the agency's counterintelligence staff, CL, and responsible for all liaison with Allied intelligence from 1954. He also ran a completely independent group of journalist operatives who performed sensitive and frequently dangerous assignments. CIA contemporaries knew virtually nothing of this group, which worked under deep snow cover, and whose secrets Angleton kept locked away in a safe in his office, to which only he had access. An accomplished grower of wild orchids, and the model for mother in Aaron Latham's Roman a Clef, Orchids for Mother, a world-class fly fisherman, a published photographer, a skillful worker in gemstones and leather, a fan of Italian opera, Paul Newman, Robert Redford, Marlon Brando, Peter Sellers, Shirley MacLaine, cricket matches and European soccer, Angleton was an extraordinary, eclectic figure. Claire Booth Luce once told him, "There's no doubt you are easily the most interesting and fascinating figure the intelligence world has produced and a living legend." 18, standing 6 feet tall, always dressed in dark clothes, Angleton, said one admirer, had the look of a Byron, very lean and starved about the jaws. He was the very image of the poet spy, the inspiration for many romantic myths about the CIA as an extension of the American liberal literary tradition. Cord Meyer's own extensive network of P-source contacts now drew him to Kenyon College, where his favorite poets Allen Tate and John Crow Ransom taught. It was here in 1938 that Ransom had founded the Kenyon Review, a magazine which shaped the literary sensibility of a generation, its prestige securing a high place on the cultural Dow Jones for the lazy backwater town of Kenyon. Here, also in 1938, a pool of talent had been residing at Douglas House, a Carpenter Gothic building in the center of campus, earmarked as the ideal isolation block for John Crow Ransom's studious, eccentric poet protégés. Known as Ransom's Boys, this group included Roby Macaulay, Randall Jarrell, John Thompson, David McDowell, Peter Taylor, and the more senior Robert Lowell, a faculty member, 19. As a student at Olivet College, Michigan, in 1937, Roby Macaulay had listened to lectures by Catherine Ann Porter and Alan Tate and observed Ford Madox Ford wandering around the campus like a pensioned veteran of forgotten wars. Macaulay later wrote the preface to the 1961 edition of Ford's Parade's End. During the war, Macaulay served for 4 years with G2, the U.S. Army Counterintelligence Corps, working as a special agent hunting down Nazis. He later fictionalized the experience in a collection of short stories, The End of Pity, which won him the Furioso Fiction Prize. After taking a postgraduate degree at the University of Iowa, he returned to Kenyon College to join John Crow Ransom as an assistant on the Kenyon Review. In August 1953, Ransom told a colleague that he had high hopes of making a fellow out of Roby if he doesn't take a job with Central Intelligence, as I've heard he's going to. 20 Cord Meyer had personally offered Macaulay a job in the International Organizations Division. After considering the offer over the summer, Macaulay accepted. Cord recruited him to be a case officer to work with Josselson because I guess he thought he could speak the right language, said Lee Williams, 21. Meyer scooped his second Ransom's boy when he recruited John Jack Thompson, who in 1956 became executive director of the Farfield Foundation, a job he held under contract to the CIA for over a decade. After Kenyon, Thompson had authored a number of scholarly articles and commanded quite a degree of influence amongst the New York literati. He got picked up by John Crow Ransom and the Fugitive Group, then later by Lionel and Diana Trilling in New York, where Thompson was teaching English at Columbia University, remembered his close friend Jason Epstein. The Trillings, who were fantastic snobs, were obsessed with Thompson and his wife, so Trilling suggested Jack as director of the Farfield Foundation, probably because he, Trilling, hoped to get money from it for the American Committee for Cultural Freedom. At the time, it all seemed like a good idea to Thompson. The KGB was spending millions, he said, but we had our friends too. We knew who was deserving and who was not. We knew what the best stuff was, and we were trying to avoid the standard Democratic crap of seeing that funds went to one Jew, one black, one woman, one Southerner. We wanted to reach our friends and help them, the people who agreed with us and were trying to do good things. Despite his long collaboration with the CIA, Thompson's entry in one edition of the Directory of American Professors under Politics reads radical. As well as Thompson and Macaulay, one other member of the Douglas House Group would also be played as an asset by Cord Meyer, but to disastrous, if darkly comic effect. To Ransom, he was more than a student. He's more like a son to me. His name was Robert Lowell. From the less prestigious classrooms of a small experimental boys' school in St. Louis, Missouri, Cord Meyer now added the young novelist John Hunt to his list of new recruits. Born in Muskogee, Oklahoma, in 1925, Hunt had attended Lawrenceville School in New Jersey before leaving to enlist in the Marine Corps in 1943. Discharged in 1946 with the rank of second lieutenant, he entered Harvard on a scholarship in the same year. There, he was editor of Student Progressive, the publication of the Harvard Liberal Union. Graduating in 1948 with a major in English literature and a minor in Greek, Hunt married that autumn and moved to Paris, where he started writing fiction, took classes at the Sorbonne, and found himself enchanted and fascinated by the Hemingway notion of an American in Paris. Following the birth of a daughter in July 1949, he returned to the U.S. to enter the Writers' Workshop of the University of Iowa, where he also taught in the classics department. There he met Roby Macaulay. In 1951, Hunt joined the faculty of the Thomas Jefferson School in St. Louis, where he stayed until June 1955, when the novel he had begun in Paris, Generations of Men, was accepted for publication by Atlantic Little Brown. It was around this time that Meyer recruited Hunt as a case officer for the Congress for Cultural Freedom. A combination of the enormous pressure of work and his own highly strung temperament had begun to affect Michael Josselson's health, And in October 1955, aged 47, he suffered his first heart attack. So Meyer decided to send in Second Lieutenant John Hunt to lighten the load. There followed the peculiar charade of John Hunt being formally interviewed by Josselson, who had already been supplied with a curriculum vitae and a list of glowing references. John Farrar of Farrar-Straus recommended Hunt for his executive ability, a careful head, and a sense of mission for the things we all believe in. Timothy Foote, assistant editor of Time Life in Paris, was confident that he would be awfully useful to have around in almost any reasonable enterprise, adding that he is a strong believer in American responsibilities overseas, but he does not feel that the United States should apologize for her efforts or influence in foreign countries. Interviewed by Josselson in February 1956, Hunt was formally appointed to the Congress Secretariat shortly afterwards. It can only be assumed that the resume and the letters of recommendation were part of Hunt's cover, useful to have in the files in order to give the appearance that his appointment was entirely above board. For Hunt, the Congress was, like Melville's C, my Yale College and my Harvard. Although he could not expect to achieve the authority that Josselson had won, after years of diligent and scrupulous management of both dollars and temperaments, the Congress benefited from the injection of new blood. The advent of Meyer's recruits signaled a new era in the Congress's relationship with the CIA. It ended the drought of case officers properly suited to the job, providing Josselson with adjutants who were intellectually compatible with the demands of the Congress. Josselson and Macaulay in particular got on extremely well. They took motoring trips together with their wives, sometimes joined by Hunt and his wife. Photographs show them tanned and relaxed, with Macaulay and Hunt looking the archetypal 1950 Americans, handsomely sporting crew cuts, chino pants, and black frame sunglasses. Back on the job, they often shared a joke at agency expense. When newly arrived CIA agent Scott Charles revealed that he was taking a different route to the office each day in case he was being followed, Josselson, Macaulay, and Hunt thought this was hysterically funny. Roby Macaulay didn't think like them, the CIA, or act like them. He wasn't cynical or smart-alecky, said Diana Josselson, who had been a friend of Macaulay's since 1941. He only ever got one thing wrong with Michael, which was that he wouldn't respond when Michael asked angrily or explained angrily about some situation. Michael would get more and more angry, and his blood pressure would rise, and he'd repeat himself again, and Roby would just sit there and say nothing. I told him once that he wasn't handling Michael properly, that he should say something and not let Michael get all steamed up like this. Meyer's recruitment drive demonstrated a strengthened commitment to the Congress, but this was proving to be a mixed blessing. The arrival of Warren Manschel in 1954, for example, was resented by Josselson, who felt that the agency's presence within the Congress apparat was becoming disproportionate. Manschel, said Diana Josselson, was sent over by the CIA to report on the Congress. He was planted on Michael, who had to find some kind of cover for him. He was part of a series of shifting relationships outside of the immediate staff, and Michael just had to put up with him. He also had to put up with Scott Charles, who was placed in the Paris office as an auditor. I rather liked him, said Diana. Later, after Michael had died, I edited his guidebook on Geneva. By the mid-1950s, Josselson's allegiance was primarily to the Congress, whose needs he instinctively ranked higher than those of the CIA. He felt that the Congress needed the agency only for the money, and Cordmeyer was keeping a close eye on his dollars, inserting CIA accountant Ken Donaldson into the Congress as its London-based Comptroller General. Josselson had even tried to free the Congress from its financial dependency on the agency, making his own overtures to the Ford Foundation. As Ford had already supported the Congress to the tune of several $millions by the mid-1950s, it might reasonably be expected that it would consider assuming the full financial burden. But the agency refused to relinquish its grip on the Congress, and Josselson's discussions with the Ford Foundation were doomed from the outset. Far from diminishing, the CIA's presence in the cultural life of the period now increased. From New York, Lawrence de Neufville wrote to Josselson with ideas for discussion in Encounter, including a piece on the subject of the conscience of the individual versus the requirements of hierarchy, which Josselson hastily recommended to Spender and Crystal. They, presumably, were ignorant of the special interest Josselson had in the intricacies of such a subject. Other agency men were unable to resist the pull of the pen. Jack Thompson continued to write for scholarly journals like the Hudson Review, and in 1961 he published The Founding of English Metre, a brilliant study of English poetry. Roby Macaulay wrote for the Kenyon Review, the New Republic, the Irish University Review, Partisan Review, and the New York Times Book Review. During his tenure at the CIA, he continued to write fiction, notably The Disguises of Love, 1954, and The End of Pity and Other Stories, 1958. The London firm of Hodder and Stoughton published a book on Afghanistan by Edward S. Hunter, another CIA operative who used the cover of a freelance writer, and roamed Central Asia for years. Frederick Prager, a propagandist for the American military government in post-war Germany, published between 20 and 25 volumes in which the CIA had an interest, either in the writing, the publication itself, or the distribution. Prager said they either reimbursed him directly for the expenses of publication or guaranteed, usually through a foundation, the purchase of enough copies to make it worthwhile. Books differ from all other propaganda media, wrote a chief of the CIA's covert action staff, primarily because one single book can significantly change the reader's attitude and action to an extent unmatched by the impact of any other single medium, such as to make books the most important weapon of strategic long-range propaganda. The CIA's clandestine books program was run, according to the same source, with the following aims in mind. Get books published or distributed abroad without revealing any U.S. influence by covertly subsidizing foreign publications or booksellers. Get books published which should not be contaminated by any overt tie-in with the U.S. government, especially if the position of the author is delicate. Get books published for operational reasons, regardless of commercial viability. Initiate and subsidize indigenous national or international organizations for book publishing or distributing purposes. Stimulate the writing of politically significant books by unknown foreign authors, either by directly subsidizing the author if covert contact is feasible, or indirectly through literary agents or publishers. The New York Times alleged in 1977 that the CIA had been involved in the publication of at least 1,000 books. The agency has never made public its publications backlist, but it is known that books in which it had an involvement include Lasky's La Révolution Hongroise, translations of T.S. Eliot's The Waste Land and Four Quartets, and naturally those books published by the Congress for Cultural Freedom or its affiliates, including anthologies of verse, Herbert Luthie's Le Passé Présent, Combat's D'Idées de Calvin à Rousseau, Patricia Blake's Halfway to the Moon, New Writing from Russia, 1964, an encounter book, Literature and Revolution in Soviet Russia, edited by Max Hayward and Leopold Lebeds, Oxford University Press, 1963, History and Hope, Progress and Freedom by Kot Jelensky, Bertrand de Jouvenel's The Art of Conjecture, The Hundred Flowers, edited by Roderick McFarquhar, Niccolo Tucci's autobiographical novel Before My Time, Barzini's The Italians, Pasternak's Dr. Zhivago, and new editions of Machiavelli's The Prince. Under the imprint of the Chekhov Publishing Company, Chekhov's works were widely translated and distributed. The Chekhov Publishing Company was secretly subsidized by the CIA. In addition to John Hunt, whose first calling was as a writer, the agency boasted several other active novelists. In Paris, Yale graduate Peter Matthiessen, later the celebrated author of The Snow Leopard, co-founded and wrote for the Paris Review and penned the novel Partisans whilst he was working for the CIA. Another of Cordmeyer's recruits was Charles McCary, who was later seen as America's answer to John le Carré. There was also James Michener, whose long career writing blockbusters with such modest titles as Poland, Alaska, Texas, Space was punctuated by a spell with the agency. In the mid-1950s, Miner used his career as a writer as cover for his work in eliminating radicals who had infiltrated one of the CIA's Asian operations. To this end, he was placed in the CIA's Asia Foundation. He later said that a writer must never serve as a secret agent for anything or anybody. Then there was Howard Hunt, author of such novels as East of Farewell, Limit of Darkness, and Stranger in Town, which won him a Guggenheim Fellowship. Whilst working for Wisner's OPC, Howard Hunt was signed to do several paperback originals with the Fawcett Publishing Corporation under the Gold Medal imprint. In Mexico, he was responsible for the Marxist writer-intellectual El Campesino's book Life and Death in the USSR, one of the first personal revelations of Stalinist terror to come out of Latin America. The book was widely translated and distributed with CIA assistance. He also assigned case officer William Buckley to help another intellectual, Chilean Marxist Eudoxio Ravines, finish his equally influential book, The Yan'an Way. In late 1961, Howard Hunt joined Tracy Barnes's newly established Domestic Operations Division. Barnes, who served as deputy director of the Psychological Strategy Board, was a strong advocate of the use of literature as an anti-communist weapon and worked hard to strengthen the CIA's publishing program. The new division accepted both personnel and projects unwanted elsewhere within CIA, Howard Hunt later wrote, and those covert action projects that came to me were almost entirely concerned with publishing and publications. We subsidized significant books, for example, The New Class by Milovan Djilas, The Definitive Study of Communist Oligarchies, one of a number of Frederick A. Prager Inc. titles so supported. Under one ghost's name or another, I was helping on a few pro-CIA novels, as well as overseeing one or two scholarly works, not to mention dashing off an occasional magazine piece on the new invidiousness of the old commie threat, says Harry Hubbard in Mailer's Harlot's Ghost. Even travel guides could contain the insights of CIA agents, several of whom floated about Europe using the celebrated photo guides as cover. Eugene Fodor, a former OSS lieutenant, later defended this practice, saying the CIA contributors were all highly professional, high quality. We never let politics be smuggled into the books. Lyman Kirkpatrick, executive assistant to the director of CIA, contributed the Armies of the World article each year to the Encyclopedia Britannica, which was owned by former Assistant Secretary of State for Public Affairs, William Benton. Sometimes, reviews of books in the New York Times or other respected broadsheets were penned by CIA writers under contract. CIA agent George Carver signed articles under his own name in Foreign Affairs, though he omitted mention of who his employers were. In England, Monty Woodhouse wrote articles for Encounter and the Times Literary Supplement. The phenomenon of writer as spy as writer, was by no means new. Somerset Maugham used his literary status as cover for assignments for the British Secret Service during the First World War. His later collection of autobiographical stories, Ashendon, was a Bible for intelligence officers. Compton Mackenzie worked for MI5 in the 1930s and was later prosecuted by Her Majesty's government for revealing the names of SIS personnel in his book Aegean Memories. Graham Greene derived much fictional material from his experience as an undercover agent for MI5 during and, it is said, after the Second World War. He once famously referred to MI5 as the best travel agency in the world. Intellectuals, or a certain sort of intellectuals, have always had a romance about intelligence services, observed Carol Brightman. It's a kind of coming-of-age experience, going into the intelligence services, especially on certain campuses such as Yale. For novelist Richard Ellman, not to be confused with Joyce biographer Richard Ellman, there was also a shared aesthetic concern. It's worth considering what these people had in common. They were all Christians in a non-sectarian T.S. Eliot kind of way. They believed in a higher authority, a higher truth which sanctioned their anti-communist, anti-atheist crusade. T.S. Eliot, Pound, and other modernists appealed to their elitist sensibilities. The CIA even commissioned a translation of Eliot's 4 quartets and then had copies airdropped into Russia. These were men, as much as Shaw and Wells, for whom the socialist century of the common man was unwelcome. They wanted the uncommon man and high culture. So they weren't just putting money into culture willy-nilly. Allen Ginsberg even fantasized that T.S. Eliot was part of a literary conspiracy mounted by his, Eliot's, friend, James Jesus Angleton. In a 1978 sketch called T.S. Eliot Entered My Dreams, Ginsberg imagined that, on the fantail of a boat to Europe, Eliot was reclining with several passengers in deck seats, blue cloudy sky behind, iron floor below us. And yourself, I said. What did you think of the domination of poetics by the CIA? After all, wasn't Angleton your friend? Didn't he tell you his plan to revitalize the intellectual structure of the West against the so-to-speak Stalinists? Eliot listened attentively. I was surprised he wasn't distracted. Well, there are all sorts of chaps competing for dominance, political and literary. Your gurus, for instance, and the theosophists, and the table rappers, and dialecticians, and tea leaf readers, and ideologues. I suppose I was one such in my middle years. But I did, yes, know Angleton's literary conspiracies. I thought they were petty, well-meant but of no importance to literature. I thought they were of some importance, I said, since it secretly nourished the careers of too many square intellectuals, provided sustenance to thinkers in the academy who influenced the intellectual tone of the West. After all, intellectual tone should be revolutionary, or at least radical, seeking roots of disease and mechanization and dominance by unnatural monopoly. And the government, through foundations, was supporting a whole field of scholars of war. The subsidization of magazines like Encounter, which held Eliotic style as a touchstone of sophistication and competence, failed to create an alternative, free, vital, decentralized, individualistic culture. Instead, we had the worst of capitalist imperialism. The defense of high culture mounted by people like Angleton was automatic. It would never have occurred to us to denounce anyone or anything as elitist, Irving Kristol once said. The elite was us, the happy few, who had been chosen by history to guide our fellow creatures toward a secular redemption. Raised on modernist culture, these elitists worshipped Eliot, Yeats, Joyce, and Proust. They saw it as their job not to give the public what it wants, or what it thinks it wants, but what, through the medium of its most intelligent members, it ought to have. In other words, high culture was not only important as an anti-communist line of defense, but also the bastion against a homogenized mass society, against what Dwight MacDonald viewed with horror as the spreading ooze of mass culture. The paradox of a defense of democracy mounted by patricians who were essentially deeply suspicious of it is hard to ignore. Positioning themselves like an elite of princes holding the pass against barbarism, they were modernists terrified of modernity and its blood-dimmed tide. In a valedictory address to Kenyon College in 1940, Robert Lowell had given voice to the darkest fears of this aristocracy. For all of you know that as the Philistines and Goths proceed in their spiritless way to dismember civilization, they will come to all the golden palaces of learning. They will come at last to Milton, Groton, St. Paul's, and St. Mark's. And there, the students who are neither efficient, nor humane, nor cultured will be doing what they are doing. And the indignant Goths and Philistines will turn these poor drones out of the hive, and there will be no old limbs for the new blood, and the world will revert to its unwearied cycles of retrogression, advance, and repetition. Convinced that they had to shore up their defenses against the coming ruin, these were the Aurelians who in 1949 had decided to award Ezra Pound the Bollingen Prize for Poetry for his Pisan cantos. One anecdote tells how one day Paul Mellon, a generous philanthropist, complained to Alan Tate and John Crow Ransom about how many writers were leftists. Mellon himself was advanced in his taste in art, but conservative in politics, almost a sine qua non of Cold War angels. Tate replied to the effect that writers were always needy, so why didn't Mellon put up some money for fellowships, awards, or whatever, which would make the recipients much happier and less inclined to be revolutionary? So Mellon put up the Bollingen Mellon Awards as private endowments worth about $20,000 each. Why did they propose Pound? Asked Richard Ellman. Because he represented the ultimate in the Mandarin culture they were trying to preserve and promote. The award sparked a huge controversy, not least because Pound was in a hospital for the criminally insane at the time, the only American charged with treason in the Second World War. His wartime broadcasts for Mussolini's Minkolpop had included tirades against Mr. Jusevolt, Franklin Finkelstein Roosevelt, Stinky Rosenstein, and Kikes, Sheenies, and the Oily People. He argued that Mein Kampf was keenly analyzed history and called its author a saint and a martyr in the tradition of Joan of Arc. America, he said, had been invaded by vermin. Carl Shapiro, editor of Poetry magazine, wrote that he was the only dissenter from the Bollingen Prize to Pound, except Paul Green, who abstained. Eliot, Auden, Tate, Lowell all voted the prize to Pound, a passel of fascists. When William Barrett attacked the jury's decision, Alan Tate challenged him to a duel. The decision to award Pound the prize re-inflamed all the art versus politics disputes that had been raging since the 1930s, and seemed to confirm what many on the left feared, that there was a disposition amongst those who called themselves liberals to forgive, or at least ignore, the historic compromises which had led many artists, many of whom were now comfortably relocated in America, to use their creative talent in flattery of fascism. At a time when art and artists were so highly politicized, it seemed insufficient to state, as the Bollingen jury did, that to permit other considerations than that of poetic achievement to sway the decision would destroy the significance of the award, and would in principle deny the validity of that objective perception of value on which civilized society must rest. How could art be autonomous on the one hand, and where convenient, pressed into political service on the other? First Lieutenant Michael Josselson, Berlin, 1948. A cultural affairs officer for the American military government, he would shortly be recruited to the CIA. Tom Braden, the CIA agent who put together the International Organizations Division, the nerve center of America's secret cultural Cold War. Braden's division ran dozens of fronts, including the Congress of Cultural Freedom, the Apparat at a Working Lunch, John Hunt, Michael Josselson, and Melvin Lasky. Stephen Spender, Manis Sperber, Minu Masani, Michael Josselson, Dennis de Rougemont, Nicholas Nabokov at the meeting of the Executive Committee of the Congress for Cultural Freedom, January 1957, Stephen Sender, chosen by the CIA and MI6 to co-edit Encounter magazine. Stephen had all the right credentials to be chosen as a front, said Natasha Spender. He was eminently bamboozable because he was so innocent. Irving Kristol, co-editor of Encounter from 1903 to 1958. Arriving in London from New York, Kristol took to wearing a bowler hat to work. Michael Josselson, Arthur Schlesinger Jr., Julius Fleischmann, and the sociologist Peter Dodge in Milan, September 1955, to discuss the future of freedom. Dwight MacDonald with Michael Josselson, Milan, September 1955, during the Future of Freedom Conference. The debates, said one observer, were deadly boring, but there were heated exchanges behind the scenes over the proposal to put Dwight MacDonald in the editorial chair at Encounter .157. Nicholas Nabokov, composer and impresario, the frontman for the Congress for Cultural Freedom. Nabokov is flanked by his wife, Marie Claire, and Michael Josselson. Vienna Opera House, 1957. Nicholas Nabokov and the actor Peter Van Eyck in the Josselsons' apartment, Paris, March 1958, to celebrate Michael Josselson's birthday. Van Eyck and Josselson had shared a billet in post-war Berlin, John Hunt, Roby Macaulay, and Michael Josselson mapping things out in the hills above Geneva. Michael Josselson embraces his friend and colleague, Lawrence de Neufville, and de Neufville's wife, Adeline. De Neufville had recruited Josselson to the CIA in 1948, and together they set up the Paris-based Congress for Cultural Freedom as a permanent body in 1950. De Neufville returned to the U.S. in 1954, leaving Josselson to cope with a series of disappointing successors, Raymond Aron and his wife Suzanne, Michael Josselson, and Denis de Rougemont, enjoying a day out in the Swiss mountains. Aron felt deeply compromised by the exposure of the Congress as a CIA front, though it is alleged he had been in on the secret for years. John Hunt and Michael Josselson, sitting beneath the brass wall plate of the Congress. The plate had been stolen from outside the Paris office some years previously, and to their amazement, had been spotted on the wall of a Geneva restaurant, where Diana Josselson took this photograph in 1969. A most effective partnership, Michael Josselson, codenamed Jonathan F. Saba, and his wife Diana, codenamed Jean Ensinger.